So hey, have you guys noticed that dumb trend that I think is finally thankfully on the decline? Where people would just repeat the same thing over and over until the tweet fills up to the limit? And it's usually the most mind-numbing nonsense too. Like, I don't see race is anti-black, or put your pronouns in your bio, or women belong in gaming spaces, or indigenous knowledge is science. These are all pretty vapid statements. Nobody denies that women belong in gaming spaces, as long as those women are gamers. Not seeing race means treating black people the same as white people, which is definitionally not racist. Indigenous knowledge is not science, because science is a method of rational hypothesization, empirical measurement, and then comparing the real data with the hypothesis, in order to update it accordingly. It's not a culture the same way that any traditional knowledge is, and that fact doesn't change just because you're brown. And putting your pronouns in your bio is a demand that you perform a small action of public allegiance to a political cause that you may not agree with. But what's going on here is that people are repeating ideological statements that may or may not be true, or may not be moral in terms of a demand, that they clearly desperately want to be true or moral, regardless of whether or not they are. This is why a common reply to these posts, like for example to this Ukraine is a terrorist state one, is to laugh at them by pointing out that repeating a statement religiously doesn't actually make it true, like it's somehow a magic spell that warps reality and generates truth value within the statement where none previously existed. Hell, even if it worked, there's gotta be some kind of diminishing return on it, right? Like, buddy, if you're at the point where you're extending into a full tweet thread on these repetitions, you should probably log off. Sometimes these people get made fun of by having a completely nonsensical statement repeated back to them, like this person who bravely declared that trans women are biological women, and in the replies they're slapped with, "My Toyota is a Lambo." This works because the second statement is of the same kind as the first, and is repeating something that is clearly delusional. Sometimes these statements have an additional little epilogue tacked on the end, just in case you didn't get the point, like how apparently climate justice is trans rights, somehow. Yeah, I figured out that you stand with your trans siblings as environmentalists. You didn't need to point that out. Or like with this one, autism jokes aren't funny, fuck your edgy humor. Well, hate to break it to you, pal. Edgy humor is always funny, even if that seems to be a rapidly evaporating position nowadays. And no, tankies are in fact bad. This one just falls into the everything is fascist camp, doesn't it? Sometimes the statements change with each repetition, like how this person wants more queer games, cute games, educational games, political games, gentle games, accessible games, games with black protagonists, games without shooting. They're using the repetition to expand on the original point, but it still feels like the same thing. Sometimes this is paired with a clapping emoji in between each word, though that fell out of style years ago at this point. On one of my old Twitter accounts, that has now been lost to time unfortunately, I posted a banger tweet about liking all types of women, and it used all of these tropes, all caps repetition, black hand emojis in between each word. It was beautiful. It made a lot of people angry. And occasionally the repetition alters between two statements, which tend to be complementary in some weird way. Like for example, the amazing atheist going back and forth between pregnant men and girl dicks. I gotta be honest here, I don't exactly know what he's getting at. Like, is he saying the girl dicks get the men pregnant, or what? This one isn't even a political slogan, it's just the amazing atheist losing his mind, which to be fair, he has been for a while. Sometimes the most nonsensical of these repetition posts actually get slapped with a community note, which is always fun. It's usually leftists who do this sort of thing, but every once in a while, I see a rightist do it too. Though I'm not sure if this is genuine or just a mockery of the fact that leftists do it so often. However, everyone's taking a swing at this sort of thing. It's not just those who have some political statement that they want repeated into existence like Dorothy clicking her heels. I've seen people use this method to give low-stakes opinions, like normalize watching subbed anime. I've seen people advertise their website or their service like this. I've seen people give blatantly self-serving takes, like the e-girl who repeated normalize simping. I've seen people just completely fucking around with it too. Now you might be asking, Dev, why are you talking about an annoying internet trend? And you know what, fair enough. It certainly is that. But it's not only an internet trend. It's the kind of thing that becomes almost dystopian the second it leaves online and enters the real world. Do you recall back in 2017 when somebody got admitted to Stanford by submitting an application that simply read Black Lives Matter 100 times? Now, people back then believed he was just going to end up failing out as some loser diversity applicant. But here we are, 7 years later. And he seems to be kinda successful, at least in terms of starting several diversity-oriented startups. And to his credit, the BLM 100 times thing was only in response to the final question of the application. He did fill out the rest of it correctly. But what's going on here is still nonetheless kind of insidious, if you know what underpins it. And the best way for you to get it is to witness this repetition in real life. Take a look.
My choice! My choice! My choice! My choice! My choice! My...
This is clearly some sort of abortion protest. The woman chanting "my choice" is pro-choice. The reporter is a right-wing influencer, probably pro-life, who's there to cover the event. Considering the amount of anger and irrationality coming off of this woman, her body language, how she's in his space, this is on the cusp of violence. She's hoping he makes even the slightest misstep in his dealing with her so that she would be justified in physically retaliating with the rest of the crowd, maybe even legally retaliating down the road. This is not a person who's currently capable of rational thinking. In Haidt's terms, the elephant has taken control back from the rider, and in the absence of critical thinking skills, only ideology and emotion remain. We all understand what it feels like to get heated during an argument over something that we're passionate about. It's the ideology part of it that's important. When she's screaming "my choice" over and over, like she's writing one of those all-cap tweets that never end, that is an ideological statement. More specifically, it's a thought-terminating cliché. When a person has cognitive dissonance, aka their beliefs and their actions are not congruent, there's only a few ways they can resolve the contradiction. One is to change their actions. Another is to change their beliefs. A third is to simply be comfortable with their hypocrisy. All of us have done all three of these at least once. The fourth, though, is to engage the situation with a thought-terminating cliché. A thought-terminating cliché is an idea that quells the feeling of cognitive dissonance without actually resolving it. It's a thought that serves primarily to make you forget about the contradiction, rather than changing something to resolve it or accepting it directly. Deploying a thought-terminating cliché is a way to remain ignorant about the contradiction. There are a ton of these floating around. Some of them are widespread, some are niche, but they're all easily recognizable by their function of stopping a debate without ever actually resolving the topic being debated. For example, when somebody says, "all's well that ends well," what that phrase means is, even though there were some problems along the way, we got to the end point, so it's not worth thinking about those problems. Put them out of your mind, even though it might actually be worth thinking about those problems, for reasons beyond the immediate goal. When somebody says, "that's just your opinion," what's being said is, everyone's entitled to have an opinion, therefore all opinions are equal, and you're bad for trying to push your opinion on others, despite the obvious objection that opinions may be more or less correct with regard to factual matters. When somebody says, "this isn't news," or "why are you surprised this is going on?" what's being said is, the person or thing being talked about is consistently at fault, so it's not like them being at fault again should be a big story, despite the obvious objection that recurring problems should be addressed even if they've become normalized. When somebody says, "if you don't like it, don't buy it," or sometimes "if you don't like it, don't watch it," what they're saying is, as a consumer in a market economy, you can and should vote with your wallet. But the phrase is also generally used to distract from the fact that the seller of a product is scamming the buyer. When somebody says, "read theory," or "I'm not going to educate you," or "do your own research," it's obviously good to do these things, but these exclamations are used to deflect away from the fact that the person saying them cannot back up what they're arguing, so they're pushing the burden of proof onto you. When somebody says, "the Lord works in mysterious ways," they're contributing unknown contradictions to divine intervention, when rationally examining those contradictions would probably yield information that you might be hiding from. A secular version of this one is, "it's not that deep, man." When somebody says, "it's fake news," that's negation of the source of an argument rather than actually addressing the argument itself. Sources may be biased, but that means you should account for the bias. Accounting for the bias might actually mean that you do reject the argument, but it should not be an automatic process. A variant of this is the phrase mansplaining and its derivatives, where the source of the argument matters more than the argument. Another variant is rejecting Wikipedia or other online sources out of hand. Now, I'm not making the claim that thought-terminating clichés are always bad. They're probably mostly bad, but I can think of many instances where you would want to deploy one. If you're having a heated debate with a friend and you didn't want to damage the friendship, and it's over something that is really not that important, you might say, "let's agree to disagree." That is a thought-terminating cliché. The contradiction hasn't been resolved. The argument isn't concluded, but valuing social stability might be more important in the moment. And so just mutually agreeing to drop it so that everyone gets to save face and calm down a bit is also valuable in its own right. At this point, you might once again be asking, "Dev, how does this relate to retarded repetitive posts on Twitter?" Well, we can link it together by looking at the origin of the phrase thought-terminating cliché. Robert J. Lifton is both a psychiatrist and a historian, and his body of academic work makes up part of the foundation of what we now call psychohistory, where the psychology of the people who engage in historic events is analyzed to explain the differences between their stated intentions and their actual behavior. Also, Lifton is still kicking at 98 years old. Good job, buddy. In 1961, Lifton published the book Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. He interviewed American soldiers who had been captured by the Chinese during the Korean War, as well as Chinese university students who had fled to the West. These interviews, as well as their analyses, form the majority of the book, and it's from these experiences that Lifton identified the ideological programming that the Chinese communists used to brainwash both Chinese citizens and American POWs into speaking demonstrably false assertions. But it's the end of the book that we're concerned with. The final section of the book is where Lifton outlines what he calls the 8 criteria for thought reform. These are the steps taken by any sort of group with a totalitarian ideology to create true believers out of the common person. Though he uses the phrase totalist in his writing, it's clear he's talking about any ideology which is totalizing, as in there is no area of human existence in which the ideology doesn't somehow claim dominion over. This applies not only to fascists and socialists, but also some religious movements, both cults and mass religions. For Lifton, to be a totalist ideology simply means the ideology must take a position on absolutely everything and leave nothing up to personal decision-making. Here are the 8 criteria. 1. Milieu control. Control the information that group members are given access to. 2. Mystical manipulation. The group's leaders manipulate experiences to appear spontaneous to group members, to prove that their movement has divine authority or exceptional capability. Once true belief is established, this can be used to reinterpret past events. 3. Demand for purity. This is the purity spiral we've talked about before, but it's more than that. For group members, the impurity has its source from the evil that exists outside the group. Rituals of public self-humiliation serve to purify believers. 4. Confession. Continuing from point 3, and taken far beyond its religious, legal, and therapeutic utility, confession reinforces the purity spiral, but it also grants the confessor a level of authority through their surrender to the ideology. 5. The sacred science. The ideology is the ultimate truth, perfectly aligned with reality. Truth cannot be found outside of the ideology. The group's leader, who's either aligned with God or is God himself, is similarly beyond reproach. In the case of material ideologies, like socialism and fascism, the leader's authority is not divine, but rather in his ability to perceive and manipulate the forces of historical materialism. But in practical terms, it's pretty much the same thing. 6. Loading the language. We'll come back to this one at the end. 7. Doctrine over person. The ideology decides who is a person worthy of moral consideration and who isn't. 8. Dispensing of existence. Following from 7, the ideology provides justification for any action to be taken against the non-persons outside of the ideology. Regarding number 6, loading the language, that is where the phrase thought-terminating cliché was first coined. Lifton wrote, "The most far-reaching and complex of human problems are compressed into brief, highly reductive, definitive-sounding phrases, easily memorized and easily expressed. They become the start and finish of any ideological analysis. In thought reform, for instance, the phrase bourgeois mentality is used to encompass and critically dismiss ordinary troublesome concerns, like the quest for individual expression, the exploration of alternative ideas, and the search for perspective and balance in political judgments. Totalist language, then, is repetitiously centered on all-encompassing jargon, prematurely abstract, highly categorical, relentlessly judging, and to anyone but its most devoted advocate, deadly dull, the language of non-thought. What Lifton is saying here is that a thought-terminating cliché exists to quell cognitive dissonance, as I said earlier. Don't think about the problems that you notice. Just let your mind settle into the peaceful stillness of non-thought, and trust that the ideology will work itself out. However, Lifton makes the same point I did, that this isn't always bad. To be sure, this kind of language exists, to some degree within any cultural or organizational group, and all systems of belief depend on it. It is in part an expression of unity and exclusiveness. He talks like us is equivalent to saying he is one of us. The loading is much more extreme in ideological totalism, since the jargon expresses the claimed certitudes of the sacred science. Lifton is making the point that in-group terminology is necessary. Every community has to have ways to easily describe phenomenon specific to that community, or at least more commonly encountered by that community. Whether we're talking about communists who use the phrase means of production to refer to any property that can produce a profit, or speedrunners who say split to refer to reaching a specific point in a speedrun of a video game, the use of a community's or a subculture's specific language can be an identifier of a person as a member of that group, or at least knowledgeable about the group's ways. The problem is that ideologues push this to the extreme, often redefining even common terms to fit the sacred science of the ideology. For example, take the phrase trans women are women. There's actually a pretty long conversation underneath that, but if you encounter someone who simply ideologically repeats trans women are women and then morally shames you for not agreeing, they are using a thought-terminating cliché. When someone does this, essentially what they're doing is turning off their brain and letting ideology take over as the autopilot. The historical event that is probably the most connected to Lifton's work, aside from the people that he interviewed, is the trial and execution of Otto Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann was one of the former Nazis who fled to Argentina after Germany lost the Second World War. He was secretly and illegally under Argentinian law kidnapped by Israeli agents in 1960 and executed in Israel in 1962. Around the same time as Lifton's 1961 book was released, the liberal political theorist Hannah Arendt attended Eichmann's trial and eventually published a book about him, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, which is often commonly referred to as just the banality of evil. Arendt wrote in the book that Eichmann tended to use stock phrases and self-invented clichés and exhibited a lack of ability to think for himself. He came to feel that implementing Hitler's policies was palatable as long as they were couched in enough official legalese and jargon. Eichmann also exhibited no anti-Semitism at all, beyond what we might call the general background anti-Semitism that you'd expect from someone who was born in 1906. But there was certainly nothing there that was Nazi-like. Eichmann's life before joining the Nazi Party was one where he defined himself by his affiliations. Arendt offers the examples of Eichmann joining the YMCA and the German Boy Scouts, and his personality subsequently changing to be about those organizations while he was a part of them. The same happened with the Nazi SS, and after World War II, Eichmann fell into a deep depression as he had no social organization to be a part of as a wanted man. Eichmann was not very intelligent, though he was considered an intellectual in Nazi philosophical circles. He was embarrassed by his lack of education and his inability to hold down a job before joining the SS, to the point that Eichmann bragged about committing atrocities that he could not have possibly done during his trial. Arendt believed that he did this not out of evil, but of a desire to be notable. Eichmann appeared to have no opinion on the extermination of the Jews one way or the other. He wasn't rabidly positive about it like a lot of Nazis were. He simply felt that because other members of German high society had endorsed the plan, he personally had no moral culpability in simply going along with the flow. This is why the most noteworthy phrase to come out of the book is the banality of evil, and why it's more known by that subtitle than the actual name. Arendt went against all conventional wisdom of the Nazis in 1963, who were at that time commonly depicted as these grotesque monsters with a moral code that is completely alien to humanity that nobody could ever truly understand. The belief was that the Nazis were, on a core level, not like us. But Arendt disagreed, and showed that Eichmann and many other Nazis might have been evil, but they were people who simply did their job and did not think about the evil that came with it. Every time a death order was stamped by a paper pusher, a victim died. But for the paper pusher, the deed is so abstracted from the result that it's easy to put it out of mind. Propaganda, being a set of thought-terminating clichés, fills in any gaps. Though Arendt and Lifton wrote their books at around the same time, and likely didn't know about each other's work, when Arendt says stock phrases and self-invented clichés, she's talking about the same thing as Lifton's thought-terminating cliché, the ideological programming that the ideologue falls back on and uses to enter into a stupor of irrational non-thought. Discarding evidence and reason, the ideologue simply needs to mouth back the ideology, and the cognitive dissonance vanishes. We all know that repetition is used for advertising purposes. Think of any lasting slogan, from "got milk" to "just do it" to "where's the beef?" Okay, maybe all of my examples aren't that used anymore. I'm a 90s kid after all. How about "head on, apply directly to the forehead"? I'm sure we all know that one. Slogans and brands stick in your mind to the point that you don't even need to think about their meaning anymore. Just think of the saying, or maybe even the jingle, and the product appears in your head, with all context attached. Maybe you even want it now. Repetition for the purposes of ideology functions the same way. What does Black Lives Matter actually mean? What does Make America Great Again actually mean? There is real answers to those questions, but most people who mindlessly chant the words over and over would be hard-pressed to actually identify what they're saying. I've spoken to Trump supporters, I've spoken to Biden supporters, to reactionaries and fascists and communists and anarchists. This is a human thing. It's not confined to one side. I've seen all types of people at one point or another stop engaging with real questions and fall back on pre-programmed talking points. I've even done it myself, as embarrassed as I am to admit it, though I do my best not to do it nowadays. Think back to the crazy woman shouting "my choice" over and over again. Do you think she might be pre-programmed? Seems like an obvious yes to me. The whole Twitter repetition thing from the beginning of the video is goofy and stupid and annoying, but it's mimicking a real-world behavior that is actually pretty toxic. If you ever watch somebody get challenged on a core component of their beliefs, and they get irrationally angry or defensive, if they deflect by reframing the conversation away from the evidence, by saying something like, "listen man, all I know is," whatever, or if they ever say something like, "stop thinking so much," in response to being backed into a logical corner, or if they ever say something like, "I'm just asking questions," when directly confronted with reality, the reason they tend to come off as slimy to the audience is because they're using a thought-terminating cliché. They're trying to shut down rational debate by repeating a phrase to quell their cognitive dissonance, and they're hoping it quells it in you, too. Don't let it. Think.